Hello and welcome to This Week in Science. This is a show where I go ahead and give you guys some news each week about the new and interesting things that are happening in the scientific world, and we try and cover quite a bit of fields here. So this is the episode for the third week of January in 2020, and we're going to go ahead and talk about 5 different articles I have for you this week. One of them is about a scorpion fossil, one is physiological, so it's decreasing human body temperature. One is about certain biomaterials, it's living building materials that are that have biological matter in them. Then there's also the first ever captured video of atoms bonding and then unbonding. And then we also have some exciting news about the environment that is actually somewhat positive, and it has to do particularly with fishing and fishery management. So let's just go ahead and start to get into these articles. I will go ahead and share my screen with you so you can go ahead and read along and look at some of the figures with me. So let's begin with the article on the scorpion. It is titled "A Silurian Ancestral Scorpion with Fossilized Internal Anatomy Illustrating a Pathway to Arachnid Terrestrialization." This is by Wendruff et al., and it was posted, or I should say published, in Scientific Reports. So this, let me go ahead and find the figure. This is the figure that shows the scorpion, the fossil. So this particular species is Perioscorpio venator. This was found in Wisconsin, and it's estimated to be about 437 million years old. This is earlier than the oldest previous scorpion fossil, which was found in Scotland, and that was dated to 435 million years ago. This fossil is particularly interesting because parts of its organ systems were preserved, and what this means is that the actual paleontologists will have a better idea of the physiological characteristics of the animal, and they'll have some idea of the internal structure rather than just the external. So that's something that is going to be certainly very interesting. Another unique aspect of this is that scorpions are one of the earliest animals that are known to have been at least partially terrestrial, which means that they could survive on land, basically, or at least go on land partially. So it's going to be interesting to study this through the scope of evolution, especially in the context of a response to environment, or a response to changing environment. And although this may not necessarily be a transitional species, the transition from water to land is something that evolutionary biologists have been very interested in and have a lot of data on. So adding this particular piece, I'm interested to see if that will change anything or add to any already existing theories. So that will certainly be interesting, and I look forward to hopefully hearing more about this particular study again later in comparison to some other ones. So let's go ahead and move on to the next article. The next article we have, and sorry, it must have been kept it there since I was reading it. The next article is "Decreasing Human Body Temperature in the United States Since the Industrial Revolution." This was published in eLife by Protsev et al. And this I found to be particularly interesting as well. So one thing that's important to know, some background information, the standard for human body temperature was set in 1851. So obviously it has been over 100 years since then, almost 200 years since then, and we have there's actually quite a difference in the average human body temperature now, which I think is actually really interesting. There's lots of different aspects that go into body temperature and metabolism, so there's actually quite a few things that could have changed. So I really just kind of wanted to share this and have you think about the different factors that actually affect things like that. But anyways, let's talk about the study we have here. The first pool of data that they got this from is the United Army Veterans of the Civil War, and this data is from 1860 to 1940. So when you hear that, that sounds like a very long time point, and it is. And there's almost 24,000 people in the study. That's quite a big number, relatively speaking, for that time period especially. So this data itself is very interesting, but if you think about this, this is taken from veterans. So interestingly enough, since this was in 1860, if you scroll down, you'll see that there were no women included in this data pool, because obviously back then it was mostly men in the army, so the veterans obviously therefore were also men. So that was something I found to be interesting, and it's important that they actually do include women in the study as well to control for sex. So that's part of the reason, I'm sure, that they looked at different study pools as well. Really, the more data you have, the better, as long as it's reliable and consistent. So I'm sure that's one of the reasons, though, that they didn't just go off this study alone. You can also see here that there's ethnicity data, which is obviously also going to be very important that they control and make sure that it's not just by race. They also include other factors such as height, weight, and age, which of course are all going to be important as well. So anyways, yes, this first data set comes from veterans in 1860 to 1940. The next study pool is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is a survey that was conducted between 1971 and 1975, and this was just U.S. civilians that were participating in this study at that time. And then lastly, the majority of the data comes from this newest time point. This is the Stanford Translational Research Integrated Database Environment, and this is based on electronic medical records and just information from patient encounters and like checkups and things like that. These all come from Stanford in California, and these are from 2007 to 2017, so that covers a decade. And the interesting thing that the researchers have found is that there is a decrease of 0.03 degrees Celsius per birth decade in average body temperature. So that was something that I found to be interesting, and I looked and read a little bit more about this in this paper, and I wanted to see what reasoning the authors proposed why this was happening. So one thing they said was that this could be due because there's just less disease and less inflammation overall in the entire population. There's also better dental care, better health care in general. There's more anti-inflammatory drugs. And now this is interesting, we have more temperature-controlled areas, so things like your house and your work, any building really you go into now, most of them have either air conditioning or heating or both. So since your metabolism makes it so that it controls your temperature, if the environment temperature is already controlled for you, then your metabolism doesn't really have to work as hard because the environment has already been corrected for you, basically. So that's interesting. It's led to a decrease in resting metabolism rate, essentially, which is what body temperature is linked to. So I found that to be interesting. There's actually quite a few different aspects that go into that because, again, metabolism and temperature are such a wide range of things that can affect that. And of course, since it is resting metabolism rate, this has been linked to longevity. So typically the lower RMR you have, the longer you live. And in terms of body size, typically if you have a lower RMR, you have a bigger body size. So I just thought it was interesting that this actually kind of follows the trends we see. Today, humans are living longer, and we're typically larger than in previous in than previously we've known to be. If you ever go to like a historical thing, sometimes they'll talk about the different stature that people used to have. So I thought that was very interesting. But one really important implication this has is obviously this could be a change in a benchmark, a medical benchmark, which is kind of interesting. I would like to see if doctors actually eventually get a hold of this study and some agency decides that instead of our 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, we see a change and maybe we'll have a different standard body temperature. That would be interesting to see. But that's all I have for that article in terms of interesting things that I wanted to cover. So the next article that we have is published in the journal Matter. It is by Heverin et al., and it is called Biomineralization and Successive Regeneration of Engineered Living Building Materials. And this is kind of out of my expertise, but I thought that was super interesting. It's very much still in the works, but the authors seem pretty dedicated to this concept in general. They realize where it has some disadvantages, so hopefully they actually try and address those, and hopefully they find a way to address those because they seem like some very prominent and challenging challenges, basically. So let me go ahead and show you the actual pictures of this material. So what this is a self-growing material, and the intention is to use this in building materials. It's microorganisms that are kind of suspended in a sand and gelatin scaffold. So the benefits of having the microorganisms in there is that can actually cause mineralization, which kind of increases the toughness and mechanical strength of the material. But it can also self-grow, and that is the part that was so interesting to me. Basically, it's like the material healing itself is the idea of this. So what they're trying to do now is kind of work out the errors and the issues that they have with this material, but this paper gives a good idea of where they are right now. So you can see here in this chart on the right, as you decrease the humidity, you get more structural integrity. So that's better. There's more calcification and biomineralization going on. However, as the humidity increases, you get more of that regeneration ability. So there is some kind of trade-off here. Hopefully they can get both these things working in tandem at a humidity that you would expect to have using building material. But I just thought it was something that was very interesting, just in general. I don't know if any of you guys have a basement or anything, but I used to have a basement, and a lot of the drainage went down to the near the basement, and it caused a lot of structural issues. There were lots of cracks in the walls. I thought it would be really interesting and really nice if we could find a material like this that can actually heal itself and just repair those cracks without having to really do anything crazy to the walls themselves. In terms of stability and structural issues, obviously things like humidity, pH, weather, and so on and so forth, and mechanical stress are going to affect how this material works, and those are all important things. If you're using these materials for building, they have to be really sturdy and really hardy and withstand a lot of conditions. The interesting thing is that they chose microorganisms that are known to withstand those harsh environmental conditions. So we all know that bacteria, they do have an optimal temperature, but they can withstand other temperatures as well. Sometimes they'll go dormant, sometimes they will die, but there are quite a wide range of environments where certain bacteria will live and sometimes even thrive. So that's one thing. The mechanical again, mechanically speaking, it doesn't do as well in wet conditions, so that's going to be kind of a bit of a challenge. There's quite a bit of rain in some areas, so they're going to obviously have to address that. So while there are quite a few issues with this, I think the idea of being able to self-repair or self-grow the building material is very interesting. So I hope that these issues are able to be worked out. So let's move on to the next article. We have the first ever video of atoms bonding and then breaking those bonds, which I thought was super interesting. So this is called Imaging an Unsupported Metal. Imaging an Unsupported Metal Bond in Diuranium Molecules at the Atomic Scale. And this is by Cao et al. So this was published in Scientific Advances. And before I really get into the meat of the article, let's just go ahead and pull up that video. So right here you can see this long striated sort of strand is a carbon nanotubule, single-walled. And then these are all the atoms. So you can see, let me find the timestamp. They're separated now, and then they come together, and then they sort of dissociate for a second as well. And it's very slow movement, and they kind of dance around each other for quite a bit of time. You can see the scale here, though. This is extremely small, and this was captured using transmission electron microscopy. So I thought that was really interesting. The authors said that this carbon nanotubule is pretty much meant to be a test tube that they could use to look at this reaction under the electron microscope. So that was really interesting to me. Again, this is kind of a breakthrough because this is the first time we have seen this on video. Which of course is impressive. So the molecules that you're actually looking at are known as rhenium. So this is a metal, and this is easy to see in the TEM video, the electron microscopy video, due to its high atomic number. It's a bit darker, whereas you can see like the carbon was a bit lighter. Like it states in the abstract, metallic bonds are really important, but we don't understand them as well as some other bonds. So it'll be interesting to see how this research actually impacts the study of this. And here you can see there's stills from the video. You can see in the living state and the standing state, which is really interesting to me. The lying state and the standing state. But yeah, you can see right here kind of the 3D structure of the carbon nanotubule and whatnot. But this is going to be impactful in that obviously this is the first time we've ever captured something like this on video, which is already interesting enough in itself. But it happened to be a metal-metal bond, which is also awesome. And also, this kind of gives people an idea to use transmission electron microscopy where they might have not used it before. So it's kind of showing a new application to use that method for. So that's pretty much all I had to say about that. I really was mostly just excited to show you guys the video because that is so amazing to me. So let's go ahead and move on to the last article I have for you this week. This is called Effective Fisheries Management Instrumental in Improving Fish Stock Status. So this is by Hilborn et al., and this was published in PNAS, or the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. So this article is really interesting to me. Whenever I am sent an article about the environment, I immediately get really sad. They're never positive, I feel like, and it's always just like, well, humans are destroying the earth and it's too late to solve it. There's really not much we can do with the way things are now. This, on the other hand, shows that we have made at least a little bit of improvement in some areas in the specific topic of fishery and fishery management. So it's maybe not much, but seeing positive news about the environment is just amazing to me. So I felt like I had to share this with you guys. So right here, what I'm showing you is a chart of the data set that they have. So basically, these dark green shows you what percentage of that country is covered in the database that they use, basically. So a little bit of background on this subject. The main fishery regulation that came from the UN was only implemented in 1994, which sounds really late to me. It took us quite a while to actually implement this regulation that is, you'll see here, is potentially changing the way that fishing is done for the good, hopefully. So the main issue that people have with the fishery industry is that they're overfishing and they're creating a low number or a low stock of fish. So that's problematic for several reasons. Obviously, it's going to affect the ecosystem. So anything that was preying on that fish or anything that fish was preying on, it really can have an impact if you overfish that species. So you're impacting species other than just the one you're fishing. So that can be really bad for the environment, obviously, and we don't want to overfish to the point where a species becomes extinct. That's obviously not good as well, and we don't want to make anything endangered either. We want there to be a nice stock, and we only take the excess, is really the main idea. Of course, that is set by government regulations as to how much we can take or we can't take, and that may or may not be in line with whatever you personally think is okay or not, or what, whatever scientists think is okay or not. It's just set by a government organization, and I'm sure it is based on data, but again, it may not line up with exactly what people think is right or not. So, other impacts of low fish stock, one thing that you might not think of is that, well, first of all, it's not good because there's less food, and the authors actually do stress in here that fish is typically consumed by a poorer demographic, especially certain types of fish. For example, tilapia is really cheap, but it's kind of a cheap way to get some really, really good nutrients. So if fish is consumed by poorer people, then having less stock means that there's less food for those people, essentially. They may not be able to afford similar alternatives that will continue to give them a balanced diet. And the fish that is available is also going to become more expensive because the harvesting is more expensive when there's less food, or when there's less of a stock, I should say. So that's some of the negative aspects of having a low fish stock, not only the typical things you think of, but some of the other ramifications as well. So this study in particular is significant because it uses a larger data set than the previous studies. So previously it was only North America, Europe, South Africa, and then New Zealand and Australia. However, this study has added some South American countries you can see here, namely Chile and Peru. They have also added Japan and Russia. And I know particularly Japan has a lot of fishery going on, so it's interesting. And then a few other countries in Europe and Africa as well. So that's something interesting to think about. We now have a larger data set, so hopefully this data is more accurate. So there were two, I would say, main findings for this study. One of them was that a low fishery management index score, or FMI score, this is basically a measure of how well the fishery industry is in a country. So it takes into account things like research, management, and enforcement, and so on and so forth. So a low fishery management index score, especially in management and enforcement, correlated with higher fishing intensity. So the places that have a higher fishing intensity, this may be due to management and enforcement. So those are things that are going to be hopefully relatively easy to correct and change. And it's particularly noticeable in certain countries. One area that the authors mention is in the Mediterranean, and then there's another in Africa as well. So if we can address those areas and stress how important this is, hopefully we'll be able to correct those management and enforcement issues. However, the main point I took away from this article, and this is great news, is that generally these fish stocks are increasing. So generally we're having more fish and more biomass that's viable, and hopefully that will continue to grow. But these stocks are generally increasing, especially in those well-managed areas. So I believe the authors also put a chart in here about management. So this has fishing intensity and some other biomass and things on there. Let's see, where's the management intensity? So you can see here, the left axis on the bottom is biomass, and then this is fishing intensity, and this is management intensity. So management intensity, where it is low, is in South America, the Mediterranean, Japan, USA. Here you can see Mediterranean, Northwest Africa, again South America, Japan, or I'm sorry, that's not USA, that's SA, so that must be South Africa. The USA is split into certain different areas like Northeast, West Coast, etc. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting to see that there might actually be a correlation between management intensity and the actual biomass or fish stock of an area. That was something I didn't really even expect them to measure. I was interested to find out that they had an index for that. So it's great that they are actually addressing this issue, and we're actually starting to see some improvements. So hopefully we can continue to work on those and, hopefully keep the fisheries management in line and have a nice large fish stock globally, not just in the US. So it was really nice, again, just to see some positive news about the environment. That's all I have for you guys this week. Let me know if you want these videos to be shorter, longer, less detail, more detail, or any other comments you have. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.